The way this session is organized, since we were in one of three groups this afternoon, is to start with just a quick recap from each of the moderators that were in the sessions to give us the highlights of what came out of that session. I will make an attempt to share some generalized observations with you, and then if there's a last word or two from the floor, I'll encourage that to happen, all closing at 5 o'clock with canapes and some refreshments. So that's our target. I would remind you too that in your folders today you have an evaluation form, and the organizers would very much appreciate if you'd fill in the boxes and leave the evaluation form on your table as you leave. So if I forget, I did remind them once. Good. Let me introduce the session chairs again, the moderators. First of all, William Power, Editor-in-Chief, Natural Gas Europe, and his topic was the role and potential of natural gas, the Canadian and EU perspectives. Secondly, you've switched. Secondly, Douglas MacDonald, who's at the University of Toronto in the School of Environment, how to translate COP21 into energy policy in Canada and the EU. And thirdly, Gaetan Thomas, President and CEO of New Brunswick Power. He's going to talk about how to be ready for the energy needs of tomorrow, clean, competitive, and efficient, and the role of innovation, R&D, and smart infrastructure. Gaetan has another commitment sharp at 5, so we're going to start with Gaetan. And go for it now, please, sir.
Thank you, Graham. Well, our panel was quite lively and the audience was wonderful. They've asked a lot of good questions and helped us to be ready for the future energy needs. And the three theme was about being competitive, being efficient, and obviously being clean. And it all zeroed around innovation, and the four panelists talk about what they were doing in their respective jurisdiction. You know, the application of smart grid in Ontario, the biorefinery in Estonia, biomass, recycling waste, and then we had a senior team player from Siemens talking about all the growth of renewable 20% year over year. So that generated a lot of discussions. And the main renewables he was talking about was mostly onshore wind and solar. So when we got into the discussions, the audience reminded us that there are other things like fuel cells, hydrogen, storage. Why storage is not in the play as strong as it should be. And the panel responded to that those two technologies today, it's a competitive issue at this stage. So within 10 years, most panelists would agree that they could be part of the solution, which brought up to the second point that we were discussing across the panel, the whole aspect of regulations and policies. And basically, the consensus would be that, we should have flexible regulation. We should not try to subsidize or favor a specific technology. You could risk being wrong with it. And I think that the general theme in the audience is that there was a promotion for smart homes. How are we going to make that happen faster? Promotion for hydrogen fuel cells, and really the regulation should be looking at a broad view. And Jeff on the panel gave a good answer on that the federal government is looking to actually promote various type of technologies. Because technology and innovation is how we're going to be able to do things faster, like the gentleman was for the smart homes there. He wanted to be ready next week. And then we talk about how difficult planning is for whether you're a utility or a supplier. This environment is changing so fast that you cannot plan 10 years ahead because technology is coming fast. So really fleet of foot, nimbleness will be required to be able to balance the grid of the future. And there was a lot of discussion about how do we balance the grid, whether you need centralized versus decentralized. Part of the issue today is the costs and synergies. How if everybody did it by themselves, can they competitively provide reliable power the same way as centralized. And maybe at the end of the day, what I got out of it is maybe it is the best of both worlds. It is a combination of synergies, some centralization, and obviously the advantages of new technologies from decentralization. So at the end of the day, I think the panel, we felt good because the audience really had some good questions, and I hope that the audience has learned something from the panelists. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gaetan. Stay as long as you can.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Gaetan as he leaves for serving as a panelist and a nice sum up today for us. Douglas, would you like to go next in turn, please?
Yes, Graham, I'd be happy to go next in turn. The subject here was how each of Canada and the EU can implement the Paris Agreement. And so, of course, on our panel, we had 2 speakers from Canada, 2 from the EU, and we had a nice dialogue going, particularly in terms of questions, how can we learn from one another, which is one of the themes that came throughout. What we were trying to do is identify for each what are the major challenges and some thoughts on how they can be addressed. Basically, challenges came in summary in 2 categories. The first is that, well, we recognize that a considerable part of the transition to a low-carbon economy has to come from bottom up, from municipal role, from cities and towns and villages. It's not going to happen in either Canada or the EU unless you have an active role from the top. And particularly in Canada, we have had such a remarkable change, 10 years of a government which was not interested in playing an active role in providing that kind of leadership, and now we have it. So there's recognition of this, but then where discussion went were the challenges that face a government which is motivated but faces some difficulties. The first is that within each jurisdiction, you have differing economic interests because of the makeup of the economy and the fuel mix within the economy. So the example was given. In Canada, we're very familiar with the higher costs of reduction, which are going to have to be borne by Alberta or Saskatchewan or the oil-producing provinces. But then we talked about Poland within the EU and this basic problem of how can you find a way to divide up, how can you allocate the transition costs and benefits in a way which is seen to be fair and acceptable. And then the second challenge, the institutional framework within each jurisdiction, and the example was given within the European Union by Jean Arnaud, one of the panelists, the fact that Europe, or the EU system, moved to the emissions trading system in part because it did not have the institutional capacity to impose a tax. That option was foreclosed just because of the rules of the game. And then within Canada, the rules of the game are such that we are in federal-provincial diplomacy. Any government has the right to opt out, which drives things down to consensual decision-making and increases the veto role that can be played by any government. So the rules of the game are important. The second one we talked about was carbon pricing, and again in 2 parts here. The first, the discussion was in terms of public acceptance of carbon pricing. The comment was made that still within Canada there's some 30% of the population which does not accept that it is needed at all. But then beyond that, even if we get to the point, in Canada we now have some 80% of the population living in jurisdictions with a carbon price, but it's at a pretty low level. And the same thing is also true of the EU. The ETS system has not produced a robust price yet. So how can you get public acceptance once you start moving up from where we are now of maybe $20 or $30 a ton? If you start to get serious and talk about $200 or $300 a ton, what happens to public acceptance? And then the final point we talked about here were the mechanisms of carbon pricing, tax versus trade, but where the conversation went is in the use of revenues, that carbon pricing itself inherently means revenues are going to be flowing into government, and there's a lot of things that can be done. The example is given of California spending their money on transit, on on basically contributing to climate change policy. British Columbia is being revenue neutral, giving it back. And the question of, if you are going to be distributing these revenues, how can this be done in an equitable way? So we didn't come up with answers on that one, but we did note that the mechanisms are important, and in particular with the use of revenues. And then the final comment that was made by a member from the floor right at the end, we need to keep attention to this ability for Canada and the EU to work together. And the feeling was that the panel itself and the discussion from the floor was a very nice example of that.
Thank you, Douglas. William, perspectives on natural gas.
Well, as was mentioned this morning, there are two problems or differences between the EU and Canada. Canada is very long in gas, although sadly very short on delivery methods to the coast and liquefaction, whereas the EU is very short on gas if it wants to diversify its supplies. It could buy all its gas from Russia, no question of that. The gas is there, the pipelines are there. However, that would be to hand over far too much power to one supplier. A supplier which, of course, we all know has in the past halted deliveries to Europe owing to disputes with the transit country Ukraine. So the EU aspiration is to diversify, and they're doing that in terms of promoting pipelines from Azerbaijan and also part funding or contributing towards the funding of LNG terminals dotted around the Mediterranean, around the Baltic Sea coast, northwest Europe, and Spain and so on, and building relatively small but transformational pieces of pipeline connections whereby gas can flow south, north and west-east, which of course is contrary to the usual nature of things where Russia supplied and Norway supplied so much gas from fixed sources. So there are limits to what the EU can do in this regard because member states have their own objectives and their own energy rules. Going back to Canada, there's plenty of gas, as I said, and the question is how do you get it to the market? There's a big problem with the price at the moment. You need to have a much higher price to get in Europe to suck gas out of Canada because of the cost of liquefaction and shipping, otherwise simply to make an arbitrage. So you have to wait for prices to rise or rise in the US, which is taking less and less Canadian gas now. And this is a problem for Canada because gas is such a big source of revenue for it. The high oil price was a big boom until a couple of years ago, 2014 when the oil price fell, but while it was $100, then the tar sands were doing well. But that's now not the situation. So there's a lot of willing on either side, but Canada doesn't have the wherewithal to support a homegrown LNG industry. It was stated, and that is a problem. You need to have a kind of a history. You have to develop a more robust history, if you like, or of producing gas on a long-term basis, for financing to come along, for contracts to be drawn up. In other words, for the supplier to be considered to be reliable. You can have as much gas as you like, but you need to have the contractual and licensing and other structures in place in order to give the lenders certainty that the contracts will be met in 10, 15, 25 years' time. And those are the main sort of points that I could summarize.
Very good, thank you. Just a few observations from myself, and then if there's points that people would like to raise. First of all, I think we started out the morning with Christopher saying that Europe is about 10 years ahead of us in terms of policy making in a serious way on climate. Not to deny the excellent work being done by the provinces, but the Commission's strategies and implementation are about 10 years old, and I would say Canada's on the verge of coming up with a new agreement between our federal government and provincial government that will move us forward in a concrete way on climate. So the history is a little bit out of pace, which is a difference, if you like. Another structural difference is that the policy has been very much a bottom-up from the point of states agreeing to a commission-based or a European-wide strategy that's been supported by the member states. And then this has been propagated through initiatives, R&D funding, etc., by the Commission. Again, there's some difference here. in that our provinces have moved ahead and our federal government is trying to pull the strings together in order to meet our long-term commitments. So a couple of differences in that regard. What we have in common are very much a commitment to tackle climate change. And I would say that discussion in Canada has moved ahead significantly in the last year or so, where it's something that most governments are talking about now in terms of moving ahead in a serious manner. The tools, pricing of one form or other, we've got a variety of the 4 mechanisms that are used. Carbon pricing in British Columbia, regulation, which I think was one of the first ever models in Alberta, where carbon was regulated and the funds related or arising therefrom directed to technology investment. The third model would be technology investment that's been done in Saskatchewan. So we've got a variety of models out there that we're trying jurisdiction by jurisdiction. One thing that we have tackled in at least 2 of our provinces so far is the cap and trade. And I think this is an example of how we can learn a lesson from what's happened with the ETS system in Europe, in that it started out with very high prices, great ambitions for the market. Then the recession came along, a lot of supply-side permits flooded into the market, and prices changed dramatically and dropped and haven't yet recovered, as I understood from one of the sessions today. So as we embark on cap and trade, the expectations for revenue, et cetera, from that source, I think need to be conditioned with some thinking about what's actually happened in Europe with the prices as they've gone forward. One common element we have in the structural sense is the role of municipal governments. We heard very clearly, there was a question from the floor today about how those governments are closest to people. Utility bills land on kitchen tables. People worry about them when they see them and have a better chance or a better direct engagement opportunity with individuals on a monthly or even a more frequent basis. So, and also, municipal governments have been very aggressive as you go city by city across Canada in implementing conservation measures and trying to find ways to diversify the mix. So it's been very positive experience, I think, that we've seen so far. And this is something we definitely share with Europe in terms of the role of the municipal governments. Lastly, perhaps, I think, perhaps not said explicitly, but we'd all agree probably that all the initiatives, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, when added up in terms of the GHG reduction, still fall short of the desired target that we have to meet. And that's certainly the case in Canada. We know that, and we have to do more. And this, in fact, will be part of the thinking in the long term as the national strategy comes together. I thought Christopher Jones' comments this morning about the initial 2020 targets that Europe had, aiming at 2020, 20% of this, 20% of energy efficiency, et cetera. And then he also talked about the 2050 targets, which are set out now as a long-term target that people will be aiming at. So I'd say more common interests than differences, although we have some fundamental structural contrasts, but still a commitment, a willingness to collaborate, and many speakers have said, and I think it's exactly right in the circumstances, is that we need to open channels and keep the channels open that we have to learn from each other. And that's going to be of great benefit, I think, on both sides as the climate file and the energy policy file in general rolls forward. Before leaving today, I wanted to thank Ambassador Cunnings for being with us today. It's been a pleasure to have you and to have you visit our different sessions, so thank you very much. Thanks also to excellencies that are in the room that I haven't recognized, and any parliamentarians as well. Thanks for coming. And thanks so much to each of you on behalf of the organizers in the EU Commission for coming today, for participating, and for keeping the room full even close to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's so much from our panel at the front. Did anyone want to add a thought or two just before we close? We have a microphone that's ready to travel. I think we're all ready for a beverage and some canapes. Thank you very much to our panel, first of all, and we look forward to seeing you downstairs. I believe we're going downstairs again to where we were for lunch to enjoy a bit of a refreshment after a long day. Thank you very much, everyone.